They called him the janitor for 3 years, not because he cleaned floors. Because when Aldridge and Coombs' finance partners needed someone to come in quietly, fix what the senior partners had broken, and disappear before the credit was handed out. They called Douglas Mensah. He knew it. He never said anything about it. That was the arrangement. Douglas Mensah had spent 31 years in finance. He had restructured debt portfolios for municipalities in 3 provinces. He had a master's degree from Dalhousie and a second one, the one he almost never mentioned, from the London School of Economics. He wore the same 4 blazers in rotation, drove a 2009 Civic that had rust along the wheel wells, and brought his lunch in a Tupperware container his daughter had bought him at a Dollarama on Bloor Street. He did not perform wealth. He had watched too many men perform wealth their whole careers and still die broke. The day everything changed, he was eating that lunch, leftover jerk chicken and rice, at his desk on the 14th floor when the email arrived. It was from Coombs himself, not an assistant, not HR. Coombs, Douglas, please come to the 22nd floor boardroom at 2 p.m. today. No need to prepare anything. No need to prepare anything. That sentence alone told him everything he needed to know about what this meeting was going to be. He finished his lunch, rinsed the container in the small kitchen down the hall, dried it, put it in his bag. He straightened his tie. The dark green one, the one his late wife Yvonne had picked out at the Bay the Christmas before she got sick, and he took the elevator up. The 22nd floor did not look like the 14th floor. The 14th had gray carpet, cubicle dividers, the particular hum of fluorescent lighting that gave everyone a slight headache by Wednesday afternoon. The 22nd had hardwood floors, natural light from windows that ran floor to ceiling, and a silence that felt expensive. Douglas Mensah had been up here exactly twice in 11 years. The boardroom was already full when he arrived. He recognized most of the faces. Coombs at the head of the table, silver-haired and tanned in the way that spoke of a Muskoka cottage and a January trip somewhere with a golf course. To Coombs's right sat Hartwell, the managing director, who had made VP at 34 and never once let anyone forget it. Beside Hartwell was a woman Douglas did not recognize, late 40s, sharp suit, laptop open, the posture of someone who was there to observe and report back. And then at the far end of the table, there was a young man, early 30s maybe. Tailored shirt, the kind of easy confidence that comes from never having had a door closed in your face. His name tag, yes, there were name tags, though no one had told Douglas to bring a name tag, read Brenton Alcott, Director of Restructuring Strategy, Alcott Capital Group. Douglas sat down in the one empty chair, which happened to be the one directly across from Brenton Alcott. Coombs cleared his throat. Douglas, thank you for joining us. As you may have heard, we've brought in Alcott Capital Group to advise on the Northgate situation. A pause. Brenton comes very highly recommended. His firm has handled similar portfolios in the U.S. market, and they'll be leading the restructuring process going forward. Douglas looked at Coombs. The Northgate situation. That's right. The Northgate situation. The file that Douglas had spent 8 months building from scratch. The file that was, as of last Thursday, 47 pages of analysis, risk modeling, and a recovery strategy that his division head had described, privately, in the hallway, not in writing, as the most thorough work she had seen in 15 years at the firm. That file. Brenton will be bringing in his own team, Hartwell added, with the tone of a man explaining something to someone who might need it explained slowly. We want fresh eyes on it. Fresh eyes. Douglas had heard that phrase before. In this building, it had a specific meaning that had nothing to do with eyes. He said, of course. He did not say anything else. On the other side of the table, Brenton Alcott smiled the smile of someone who had been told this would go smoothly. I'm looking forward to getting into the material. I've heard you've done a lot of good groundwork. Groundwork. That was another word with a specific meaning. Douglas nodded once. Happy to help however I can. He took the elevator back down to 14. Here is something that nobody tells you about being the kind of man Douglas Mensah was in that building, in that city, in this particular industry. When you are a black man in finance in Canada, not New York, not London, Canada, where people will look you straight in the eye and tell you with absolute sincerity that there is no racism here, that we are not like that we are better. You learn very early that there are 2 kinds of competence. There is the competence that gets noticed, celebrated, written up in the company newsletter. And there is the competence that gets absorbed, redistributed, and quietly attributed to someone else. Douglas Mensa had been practicing the second kind of competence for 3 decades. He had stopped being angry about it a long time ago. He was not sure if that was wisdom or something sadder. He suspected it was a little of both. But he had also been doing something else for 3 decades, quietly, carefully, without announcing it. He had been keeping records, not in any malicious way, not with an agenda, just the habit of a man who had learned early that memory was unreliable and paper was not. Every analysis he had ever produced, he had dated, signed, and filed with a copy kept at home on a hard drive in his desk drawer. Every email in which someone above him took credit for his work, he had forwarded to a personal account, not because he planned to use it, just because his father had told him once. Keep your receipts, son. Not because you're planning to go to war. Just so that if war comes to you, you're not standing there empty-handed. His father had been a bus driver in Scarborough for 30 years. He had been the wisest man Douglas Mensa ever knew. The Northgate restructuring was a file involving a commercial real estate portfolio in northern Ontario. 4 properties, 2 in Sudbury, 1 in Timmins, 1 outside of Sault Ste. Marie, that had been sitting in distress for 2 years before anyone at Aldridge and Coombs had the courage to touch it. The lenders were getting restless. The municipality was involved. There were pension fund obligations tangled up in 2 of the properties that made the whole thing legally complicated in ways that most of the firm's senior people had decided was someone else's problem. Douglas had volunteered for it. That surprised people. Which surprised Douglas, that it surprised them. He had spent 8 months doing what he always did, reading everything, calling everyone, drawing maps on paper that most people thought was an old-fashioned approach until they saw the maps. He had spoken to the municipal planning office in Sudbury 4 times. He had driven to Timmins in February, which is not a sentence anyone says lightly, to walk through one of the properties himself. He had found a restructuring path that protected the pension obligations, satisfied the lenders, and gave the municipality something workable. It was not a glamorous solution. It was a correct one. Now Brenton Alcott was going to present it. Douglas understood this. He understood it the way you understand weather. Not because you like it, but because you have lived in Canada long enough to know that some things are going to happen regardless of your feelings about them. He went home that evening, made himself a cup of tea, and sat in the chair in the living room. Yvonne's chair, the one he had not been able to move in 4 years, and he thought for a long time. Then he went to his desk, opened the drawer, took out the hard drive. He was not angry. He was something quieter than anger and more patient. The presentation was scheduled for the 3rd Thursday of November. Alcott Capital had been given 3 weeks to review the file and prepare their materials. The audience would include Coombs, Hartwell, the woman with the laptop whose name Douglas had since learned was Renata Blythe, a senior partner from a Bay Street law firm who had been retained to represent the pension fund trustees, and 4 representatives from the lending consortium. Douglas was not on the attendee list for this meeting. He found out about the final presentation time and date the way he found out about most things on the 22nd floor. From Janet in reception, who had worked at Aldridge and Coombs for 22 years and operated on the quiet principle that the people who actually did the work should, at minimum, know when the work was being presented. He thanked Janet. He bought her a coffee from the Tim Hortons on Adelaide. She waved him off and told him to stop being ridiculous. On the morning of the 3rd Thursday, Douglas came in at his usual time, which was 7:15. He settled at his desk. He opened his laptop. He did 3 things. First, he sent an email to Renata Blythe, whose contact information was public on the law firm's website, with a subject line that read Northgate Portfolio, Background Documentation. Attached was a PDF, dated, time-stamped, 47 pages, his name on every page, his analysis, his models, his recovery strategy. He did not say anything about the presentation happening that afternoon. He simply said he understood she was advising the pension trustees on the Northgate situation, and he wanted to make sure she had access to the original analytical work in case it was useful. He pressed send at 7:23 a.m. Second, he forwarded the same document with a brief professional note to each of the 4 representatives of the lending consortium. Their names and emails were on the file because he had been the one corresponding with them for 8 months. He knew these people. He had spoken to one of them, a portfolio manager in Winnipeg named Claudette Haverford, 6 times on the phone. She knew his name. He pressed send at 7:31 a.m. 3rd. He poured himself a second cup of coffee, sat back in his chair and read the news on his phone like it was an ordinary Thursday. Because it was. That was the thing. Douglas Mensa had not done anything extraordinary. He had simply made sure that the people in that room this afternoon already knew who had built what they were looking at. The rest of it, that was just time doing what time does. Renata Blythe arrived at the 22nd floor boardroom at 1:45 p.m. She had printed the PDF, all 47 pages. She set it on the table in front of her. Brenton Alcott arrived at 1:52 p.m. with 2 members of his team and a slide deck that had his firm's logo on every page. He opened with a brief biography of himself and his firm. He used the phrase fresh perspective in the second sentence. He used the phrase strategic repositioning in the fourth. By the 7th slide, Claudette Haverford, the portfolio manager from Winnipeg, who had indeed recognized the analysis the moment she opened her own copy at 6 o'clock that morning, raised her hand. "I'm sorry," she said. "Could you tell me, whose model is this?" Alcott looked at the slide. This is based on Alcott Capital's proprietary analytical framework. Claudette Haverford set her own printed copy of the 47 pages on the table. She turned to the slide that corresponded to what Alcott was showing. This model, specifically this model, with these property classifications and this recovery timeline. She turned the page toward the screen. "It's identical." The room went quiet, not the polite kind of quiet, the expensive kind. Renata Blythe turned her printed copy to the same page. Her face did not change expression, but she uncapped her pen. Hartwell said carefully, "I'm sure there's a reasonable explanation." "I received this document this morning," Claudette Haverford said, "from a Douglas Mensa. He said he had been working on this file for 8 months. She looked at Coombs. "Is Douglas Mensa on your staff?" The silence that followed that question was a specific kind of silence. It was the kind that happens when a room full of people suddenly understands that they have all been looking at the same thing, and only some of them were seeing it clearly. Douglas Mensa was on the 14th floor when Hartwell appeared in his doorway at 3:20. He looked up from his screen. Hartwell was a man who had built his entire career on the performance of composure, and he was not entirely composed. "Coombs would like to speak with you." Douglas saved his work. He picked up his green thermos. He followed Hartwell to the elevator. On the 22nd floor, the boardroom was mostly empty. The lending consortium representatives had gone. Brenton Alcott and his team had gone. Renata Blythe was still there, sitting at the table, her printed copy closed in front of her. Coombs was at the window looking at the city. He turned when Douglas walked in. "Sit down, Douglas." Douglas sat. What followed was not an apology. People like Coombs did not, as a structural matter, apologize to people like Douglas. What it was instead was a conversation in which Coombs said several things that, if you remove the careful language and the habit of self-protection, amounted to an acknowledgement that the work was Douglas's, that the situation had been handled poorly, and that the firm was prepared to recognize this, formally, financially in writing, if Douglas was prepared to handle this quietly. That last phrase, "handle this quietly," was the hinge of the whole conversation. Douglas looked at Renata Blythe. She looked back at him with the neutral expression of a lawyer who has heard this kind of conversation many times and knows exactly what it is. He looked at Coombs. He looked at the window. He looked at the city spread out below, November gray, the lake just visible beyond the towers, the particular flat light of a Toronto afternoon that he had been looking at from various office windows for over 30 years. He thought about his father. He thought about Yvonne. He thought about the 47 pages dated 8 months ago. "I appreciate the conversation," Douglas Mensa said. "I'd like my response to be in writing." He stood up. He picked up his thermos. "And I'd like to copy Renata Blythe on it, if that's all right with you." He did not wait to hear Coombs's answer. He walked to the door and he stopped and he turned back, not to Coombs, not to Hartwell, but to Renata Blythe, and he said, "Thank you for printing it out." She uncapped her pen again. "I always print things out," she said. The settlement took 4 months to negotiate. Douglas Mensa did not talk about it publicly, and he still doesn't. That is his choice, and it deserves to be respected. What is known, he left Aldridge and Coombs in March with a package that was, by any fair accounting, an acknowledgement of what had been taken from him and what it had been worth. He filed no complaint with any regulatory body. He gave no interview. He did not post anything on LinkedIn, which, if you knew the culture of Bay Street finance, you would understand was a statement in itself. Renata Blythe sent him a card. He has it on his desk at the office he works out of now. His own office. His own firm, a single-room operation in a building on King Street West that he shares with 3 other independent consultants. The practice is small. It is selective. It is entirely his. The Northgate portfolio, his recovery strategy, implemented finally with the structure he had designed, closed successfully the following spring. The pension obligations were protected. The municipalities had something workable. It was, by every measure, a correct solution. There was no company newsletter to put it in. That was fine. Some things do not need to be announced. Some things only need to be done. On the wall behind his desk, Douglas Mensa has one piece of paper in a frame. It is not a diploma, it is not an award. It is a single printed page, the title page of the 47-page analysis, with the date and his name. His daughter asked him once why that, of everything, is what he put on the wall. He told her because it was already finished when they came to take it. They could take the presentation, the credit, the room. They could not take what was already done. She looked at it for a moment. She said, "Grandpa used to say something like that." He said, "I know. I learned it from him." The city sits outside his window, the same city it always was, November turning to December now, the lake going dark early. He is working on a new file, a different municipality, a different province, a different kind of distress. He does what he always does. Reads everything, calls everyone, draws maps on paper. He brings his lunch in the same Tupperware container. He still wears the green tie on Thursdays. Some people are only ever seen after they are gone from a room. Douglas Mensa does not mind that anymore. He spent 31 years being quiet in rooms where other people were loud, and he understands now that the room was never the point. The work was the point. The work was always the point, and the work was already done.